When it comes to Reconstruction, we've previously looked at the wartime plans, mainly Lincoln's plan, as he conceived of, more towards the end of the war, the Radical Wade-Davis bill, as well as the 13th Amendment in and of itself. Now, when we get to the concept of presidential reconstruction, all right, Johnson assumed the presidency upon the death of Abraham Lincoln. Now, he's a Democrat from Tennessee, and he was actually the only Confederate senator who didn't resign his seat once his state seceded, because he's a staunch Unionist. He replaced Hannibal Hamlin of Maine for Lincoln's second presidential bid because it was presumed he would bring balance to the ticket. Now, Johnson was born poor and had no formal education to speak of, which is similar to Lincoln. And he despised the wealthy and the rich, even though he kind of wanted to be one of them. Because within Tennessee politics, the politicians really didn't like the sway and influence that the planter class had, even though they all kind of wanted to be part of that planter class. His entire life appeared to be driven by a singular quest for power, and he was an individual who clung steadfastly to his views. If you present him with an alternate opinion or facts that maybe refute his viewpoint, he'll just dig at his heels even more. Now, Johnson's initial plans mirrored Lincoln's in that he declared all participants in the rebellion who swore an allegiance to the U.S. to be pardoned. The most visible rebels and the wealthy were to be excluded, but they could personally appeal to Johnson for amnesty. Of the 15,000 who personally appealed to Johnson, 13,500 of them received full pardons. So these special pardons are really handed out pretty frequently. Johnson also wanted state conventions called to formally abolish slavery and nullify state ordinances of secession. Now, most of the pre-war Southern leadership would be restored to power, and the federal government was pretty much going to be removed from specific governing roles in the South. Once the seceding states accepted the terms, the occupying army and the Freedmen's Bureau would subsequently withdraw. From the beginning, there were rumblings that the South would fail to accept even these basic, simple terms. Mississippi actually refused to ratify the 13th Amendment, and South Carolina had only repealed their ordinance of secession rather than nullify it. And this implies that the ordinance was still legal, and South Carolina is therefore not in the Union. To get an accurate gauge of how Reconstruction is going in the South, a Republican politician, a former general in the war, and an abolitionist named Carl Schurz was dispatched to appraise the situation. And he is shocked because he concludes that it's as if the war never occurred. State governments returned to the status quo antebellum, meaning the way things were before the war. They sent former generals, former Confederate cabinet members, and congressmen back to Washington, and they armed and reactivated their militias as well. It was clear that Johnson's plan was not going to work, and partially because Southern states felt that they had one of their own in the White House. The report of Carl Schurz ended with an explanation of the terror that white Southerners were inflicting on black Southerners, including whippings and murder. He believed that among the Southerners, there was an utter absence of national feeling, and that all of Southern society would need to be reconstructed. He believed that there needed to be a strong and continual military presence in the South to protect and defend the rights of the freedmen. Now, meanwhile, Johnson didn't quite trust what Schurz had to say, and he believed that his findings were motivated by politics. So Johnson's plan and his kind of growing ignorance are what's going on in the South allows for the perpetuation of what's referred to as the lost cause myth. And the lost cause holds that slavery was viewed positively, and the cause for which the Confederates fought was just and noble. It's that their soldiers and generals were better and were overpowered by the numbers of the North. Former Confederate generals actually received ovations wherever they went, and Robert E. Lee was treated like a god. Remember that oaths during this time were viewed as sacred, but taking an oath to the Union is just viewed as a hoop to jump through to regain their former status. So again, nothing seems to have changed. One by one, the all-white legislatures of southern states began to adopt so-called black codes. And these codes deal with the conduct of African Americans. Now, these laws dealt with a variety of issues concerning the freedmen. There were legal rights that were defined, and they were allowed to bring cases to court, testify at trial, and keep custody of their children. So, in a sense, they were viewed as an advancement, but for the most part, it's clear that they have a goal in mind. For example, they did things like outlaw vagrancy and require black residents to be employed, usually under the terms dictated by white planters. It's clear that the codes are a method of ensuring that slavery still exists, just under a different name. South Carolina's code prohibited a freedman from entering any employment other than agriculture or domestic service. So they're designed to really bring back slavery under a different name. All right, so this is the situation in the South in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. So even though President Johnson is a Unionist who had stuck with the U.S. despite his home state's secession, Johnson is still a Democrat in the sense that he believed in the concept of states' rights. Now, Northerners really did want to move on from the Civil War, but they were increasingly disgruntled that prominent Confederates were back in office, and white Southerners were downright defiant in their actions toward Reconstruction and black rights. This war was supposed to have ended slavery once and for all and demonstrate the supremacy of the federal government. But they were in doubt in December 1865, and it really doesn't help that the president doesn't necessarily personally agree with some of these policies. Trying to eliminate the black codes was high on the agenda of congressional Republicans. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was designed to address these codes. Essentially, this is a precursor to the 14th Amendment in that it defined national citizenship and provided equal protection under the law. Now this law shifted more power away from the states and towards Washington, and that's the main reason why President Johnson vetoes the law. Congress overrode the veto with a 2/3 majority vote, and this is the first time in history that this had ever occurred. Congress had never overridden a presidential veto before. This is also when the 14th Amendment was written, passed, and sent to the states. Congressional Republicans wanted a guarantee of the rights of freedmen. Now, Johnson personally opposes the 14th Amendment, and he attempts to make his case to the people, beginning in August 1866. Midterm elections were going to be held that fall, and Johnson went on what was called a swing around the circle tour of northern states to gather support for his policies. Now, as you can see from the cartoon, he brought Ulysses S. Grant with him. He's by far the most popular general from the war, and realistically, he might be the most popular man in America. Crowds really warmed to Grant, and they kind of cooled towards the president. And remember, this is really something a president has never done before. Many of the listeners were actually opposed to black suffrage and wanted the nation to heal from the Civil War. But they were really put off by Johnson's demeanor and his attitude. Johnson was even known to verbally spar with an attendee at one of his rallies. The sitting president went back and forth. And this was really common in the world of Tennessee politics in which he came of age, but it was unusual for a national politician, much less a president. The end result was that the midterms went terribly for the Democrats. It blew up in Johnson's face. Republicans gained what was called a supermajority in the House and Senate. They had a clear 2/3 majority, which means it's veto-proof. So Republican politicians, specifically radical Republicans, are going to interpret this as a mandate to begin their own Reconstruction policies.